For you to have at least a very, very basic knowledge on Fabric and the components that you have in Fabric. And regardless, we'll be going into the basics much as possible throughout this session. And um, even after that, if you do have any questions or if you do have any confusions, uh, please feel free to reach out to me on that front. So that is pretty much that. Now, a little bit about me. Yeah, I would. Yeah, sorry. Right. So I'm Thimantha. Thimantha Vidanagamage. Now my second name is really long, I know, but you can call me Thimantha. And I'm currently working as a data engineer at Almost Canada. So Almost Canada is one of the largest pension funds here in Canada, and I'm working in the corporate sector there. And apart from that, I'm really passionate about the Microsoft data technologies, and namely Azure Synapse, Azure Data Factory, and of course, Microsoft Fabric as well. So these are pretty much the tools that I'm really passionate and I'm really curious about. And the session that I'll be presenting is simply about the challenges and also the concerns that we have about moving the Synapse data flows that we have in our previous solutions, or migrating the Synapse data flows that we have into Microsoft Fabric, right? So a little bit of detail on this agenda. So firstly, I will take you through an introduction to Synapse data flows and how it is used in data architectures. And later on, we'll look at migrating solutions from Synapse to Fabric and the considerations for it, specifically in terms of data flows, right? And also, finally, I'll be wrapping up this session by showing you the options available to migrate Synapse data flows. So that is pretty much what this session would be all about. Apologies, I just want to reshare my screen here. So just please give me one moment and I would definitely reshare my screen. Right, I think this should be good. All right, so I'm just resharing my screen here. Um, I think this should be okay. Right, thank you. And I will share my screen back. Right, so that was simply about the agenda, right? And moving further into the topic itself, firstly, let's understand what are Synapse data flows. Now, firstly, Synapse data flows, uh, sorry. Firstly, Synapse Data Flows was actually a component that was introduced firstly to Azure Data Factory. Now, in Azure Data Factory, there was an era where they had two types of data flows. One type was mapping data flows, and the other type was wrangling data flows. Uh, Mapping data flows, you do have it in Azure Data Factory as data flows now, and the wrangling data flows, they actually moved further into they improved it and renamed it as Power Query in Azure Data Factory. Alright. So this mapping data flows tool in Azure, or simply the mapping data flows component in Azure Data Factory, Microsoft brought it into Synapse. Synapse as Synapse data flows, right? So that is pretty much what you what is Synapse data flows, and what is the speciality of it is that it's simply code free and no code. It's a no code transformation tool. What that means is that you can do data transformations and cleansing to your data uh, without using any kind of a code, right? For what that means is that you do need to know Python or even SQL, Java, whatever it could be to simply transform and cleanse your data. You can do it with the drag and drop functionality that you have in Synapse Data Flows when use the Synapse Data Flows, right? So that is the speciality of this Synapse Data Flows. And uh, also, like with most of the other components and most of the other features that you have with Azure Synapse or even Azure Data Factory, the mapping data flows at the end of the day should be executed as a pipeline activity, right? So you would build the mapping data flow separately as a separate component to do your transformations, and afterwards you need to make sure that you call that in a pipeline activity to run it in your pipeline, right? And apart from that, another important factor or another important point on these Synapse data flows is that underneath these Synapse data flows, it is running in Spark, Apache Spark clusters, right? What does that mean? Whatever the components or whatever the drag and drag functionalities that you use in the Synapse data flows with your UI in Synapse, at the end of the day, gets converted into Spark code and is executed in Spark clusters, right? So Spark, if you do know what Spark is, it's a big data processing engine, and what that would mean is Synapse data flows would work smoothly when it comes to big data workloads as well, right? So that is a little bit of insight for you on the Synapse data flows before we move any further. Now, where does the Synapse data flow lie in your data architectures? Now, what you see in the screen right now is the enterprise, a Microsoft reference enterprise data architecture, a data warehouse architecture. Um, so this was taken from the Microsoft documentation itself. And so if I just brief you on what this entire architecture looks like. So firstly, you would get data from ingest data from different data sources into your Azure Data Lake storage or into any kind of a storage. And from this particular storage, what you would do is you would prepare your data for analytical purposes. You do data preparation, transformations, and then you would load it into probably a data warehouse or a space where you can consume your data for analytical purposes. Then finally, what you do is you you simply build reports. So you would say you would get the data, consume the data from that particular location, and you would simply build reports and provide analytical solutions for your audience, right? So that is pretty much what this entire architecture looks like. And in this architecture, the Synapse data flows with fall in this particular area, which is prep and train. In other words, data preparation, or you can also call it transformation and data transformation and cleansing related tasks, right? So after you ingest the data, you need to make sure that you prepare the data for analytical purposes, because the data that you get from different sources, they are not prepared and ready for analytics. So what you do is you need, with the use of Synapse data flows, after you ingest the data, you can get that data, transform the data and cleanse the data and load it back into a location where it can be consumed for analytical purposes. So this is where this would lie. This is where Synapse data flows would lie in an overall data architecture. Also, if you look at it from the medallion architecture point of view, where you have the bronze, silver, and gold layers, um, Synapse data flows can be used from anywhere between bronze to silver and silver to gold. And So let's say you have the raw data in the bronze layer, and from that, for you to get the data validated and up to date, you can simply use the Synapse Data Flows as well. Also, you make sure that your data is enriched at the end for consumption. For that, you can simply use Synapse Data Flows as well, right? So that is pretty much how it looks like in the medallion architecture kind of build. Right. So firstly, we went through the Synapse data flows and got ourselves into an understanding on what these Synapse data flows are. And secondly, we looked at where does the Synapse data flows lie in our architecture. So in other words, where do we use these Synapse data flows in our architectures? Next up, let's get into the point itself. All right, migrating from Synapse to Fabric. Right now, as you might know, um, now, Fabric rollout came down last year, and with that, definitely, with that, definitely data teams are considering to move their solution if they are actually building solutions in Azure Synapse, or if they have certain data solutions already in Azure Synapse or even Azure Data Factory, they would probably be considering to move to Fabric, because obviously the Fabric is the era that would be that would come ahead in the future, right? So that's all here, right? So so definitely there would be considerations and also interest mainly to move the solutions that you are already running in Azure Synapse to Fabric, right? Now, what are the considerations, or what are the uh, concerns that you have in this process? Now, a key consideration that I understood while thinking down these lines is the mapping data flows, is the Synapse data flows issue, right? So mapping data flows, or in other words, you call them Synapse data flows. You have them in Azure Data Factory, and also you have them in Azure Synapse Analytics. But unfortunately, they are not brought forward as a component or feature in Microsoft Fabric, right? So that particular data flows component does not exist anymore, right? So so that means we would have to use other alternatives to actually alternatives for our data transformations and cleansing when we are migrating solutions from Azure Synapse to Microsoft Fabric, or Azure Data Factory to Microsoft Fabric, right? Now, this is once again, this situation would arise if you had used Synapse data flows or mapping data flows in your previous solutions. If you had not, let's say that you had done the transformations and cleansing with notebooks, it could be Azure Databricks or Synapse notebooks. If you had done your transformations and cleansing with some kind of a notebook, it could be a Synapse notebook or an Azure Databricks notebook, you are completely fine, right? But this situation would arise for anyone who had actually used, or any teams that who had used a Synapse data flows or mapping data flows for their transformations and cleansing, right? So with that, like if you had used Synapse data flows or mapping data flows in Azure Synapse or Azure Data Factory solutions, you would definitely have to consider one of these two options to move your transformation and cleansing components in your existing solutions to Fabric, right? So one option to do this is with the Dataflow Gen 2, right? Now, Dataflow Gen 2, the experience of it's you can call we'll talk about more details in the next slide, um, but it is simply like a Power Query component that you have in um, that you have in Microsoft Fabric, and we'll talk more about it in the next slide. And also, then you have the Fabric notebook, which is very identical to the Synapse notebook or Azure Databricks notebooks if you had used previously. Uh, that is pretty much that. And moving into the next slide, let's actually dig a little deeper into this Dataflow Gen 2. What is this Dataflow Gen 2, right? Now, you can also call Dataflow Gen 2 as the next generation of Power BI data flows, right? So the experience of it is very identical to Power BI data flows, but definitely there are improvements and there are additions to that, which is probably why they call it a Gen 2, right? Uh, that is that. And if you had used previously in Azure Data Factory, if you had used Azure Data Factory before, in Azure Data Factory, as I mentioned previously, you had a feature over a data flow that's called Wrangling data flow that later on got renamed into Power Query in Azure Data Factory, right? So the experience there is very identical to the experience in Dataflow Gen 2 as well. So that is pretty much what this tool is, right? And also, yeah, so yeah, it's very identical to the Azure Data Factory Power Query component as well. And once again, it's a code-free, no-code data transformation tool, right? Now, it is like Synapse Data Flows. So in Synapse Data Flows, once again, you do need to overmapping data flows. You don't need to use any kind of code to do your transformations and cleansing, right? That is not required. So you can simply use the drag and drop features and simply do your you can use the drag and drop features and simply do your transformations and cleansing. Um, in when it comes to Dataflow Gen 2, yes, it is code free and no code as well, like the Synapse Data Flows. But for this, an addition is the Power Query for data transformations, right? So not an addition, but the key difference between a Synapse Data Flow and a Power Fabric Data Flow Gen 2 is that the Power Query, right? So in the Fabric Data Flow Gen 2, it is entirely based on Power Query, right? So you can do all the transformations with Power Query, very identical, once again, very identical to the Power BI data flows, and also the Power Query component in Azure Data Factory, right? So that is simply, and also if you had simply done some data transformations in Power BI Desktop, simply the experience there is very identical to that as well, right? So once again, so that is pretty much what this data flow Gen 2 tool is all about. And also something that you need to keep in mind is once again, like you would do so what you need to do, how this works is you would do the data build the data flow with all the transformations and cleansing, and later on what you do is you would execute that as a pipeline activity, right? So that is pretty much how it works, very identical to Synapse data flows. But a key difference or something that you really need to keep in mind here is that the data flow Gen 2, we don't have a Spark cluster running underneath. Now, something that I mentioned about the Synapse data flow is that in Synapse data flows, you have a Spark cluster running underneath it. So whatever the transformations and cleansing that you do with the UI, you do with the drag and drop features, it would later on get converted to Spark code and executed under a Spark cluster. Now, this process does not happen with the Synapse Dataflow Gen 2, right? It is not running under a Spark cluster, and that means it's not very suitable or not very compatible, or I would say, yeah, not the. I would say it's not well, it wouldn't be the best solution for you to use if you do have big data workloads, right? Or if you, it would not be the best feature you could use if you do have big data workloads, right? So that is pretty much the data flow Gen 2 feature, and we'll dig into more on this data flow Gen 2 in our demo. But next up, if we just look at the Fabric notebook. Right now, the Fabric notebook is very identical to the Synapse notebook. The experience, how you run it, is exactly, I would say, an improved version of the Synapse notebooks. Once again, we'll be going through the details in our demo. And this is once again a code-based feature. This is a code-based feature. Now, Dataflow Gen 2 and Synapse Data Flows, they were not code-based. You don't need to know any code. You didn't need to know any code to actually do your transformations and cleansing, right? So that was totally not required. But when it comes to Fabric notebooks, you simply need to know code to actually do your transformations and cleansing. So in the Fabric notebook, you can write code in PySpark, Spark Scala, and also Spark SQL, and also Spark R. But what we frequently use, at least as per my experience, is PySpark. We use a lot of PySpark to do our data transformations and cleansing. And yeah, long story short, you need to know code if you are using Fabric Notebook, and you can't say it's not like it's not like Dataflow Gen 2 and also Synapse Data Flows where you can use the drag and drop features and do your transformations. You definitely need to know code if you are going with Fabric notebooks, right? Once again, now an advantage a key advantage of the Fabric notebook is that it's once again running under Spark cluster, right? Underneath the Spark cluster. So that means it is highly recommended for big data workloads, right? So if I just brief you a bit on that, brief you a bit on if I just compare one-on-one with Dataflow Gen 2 and Fabric Notebook, the key difference between these two is that the Fabric Notebook is running underneath the Spark cluster, while the Dataflow Gen 2 does not have any Spark cluster underneath that. So what would that mean is that Fabric Notebook it would be compatible and much more feasible to use with big data workloads. But Dataflow Gen 2, definitely you would run into problems if you go with big data, if you simply do data transformations and cleansing for big data workloads, right? So that is pretty much the key difference on these two items. Yeah, that is pretty much it. So if I just brief a little bit once again before we get into the demo front, uh, Dataflow Gen 2, code free, and it's running with Power Query. The experience is very identical to Power BI data flows and also the Power Query feature in Azure Data Factory. And Fabric Notebook code base, you need to know code. Specifically, we use a lot of PySpark to do our data transformations and cleansing when it comes to Fabric notebooks, and it is highly recommended to use for big data workloads. If you are doing data transformations and cleansing for big data workloads, you would definitely go for a Fabric notebook, right? So that is a little brief on these two options that you have. All right. Now, next up, if I go into the demo front, all right. Once again, I would share my screen into my demo environment. So for the demo environment, what I'm using is actually my workspace. So I had actually assigned a Fabric capacity to my workspace, and I'm using that to do all my like I would say R&D and also the demos that are related to sessions. Right. Now, firstly, I would just give you a little bit of context on this demo. Firstly, I'm doing some data ingestion here, right? I'm getting to referring to two tables that are in the AdventureWorks database. One table is the customer table, and the other table is the product table, right? I'm referring to those two tables, and I'm doing a metadata driven ingestion, and I'm ingesting tables those two tables as CSV files into my Fabric Lake house, right? So this is pretty much this is pretty much my Fabric Lake house. And if you go into the Lake house, you can see those two files ingested, right? So you have sales LD customer and sales LD product, right? So we had ingested the data already into our environment, right? Into our lake house. Now, the next task that we'll be looking at is how do we transform the data that we have in these two files, and how do we load it into as tables into our lakehouse, right? So that is pretty much what we'll be looking at with Data Flows Gen 2 and also with the Fabric Notebook, right? So once again, I had done this already. I would take you through that and how that actually works. Right. Firstly, let's start with the data flow gen 2, right? Now, if I take you through to into take you into a data flow gen 2 that I had already built. Mm, so yeah, I'm just looking into yeah, I think this is good. Yeah, the transform customers DF, right? So this is pretty much what my data flow looks like, right? Now I had built this already. Just done some very minor transformations. You can see the experience here is very identical to Power BI data flows and also Power Query in Azure Data Factory, and also just the data transformations in the regular Power BI desktop, right? So you would simply get the data. So this is the file that I'm referring to, sales LT custom CSV, which I had already loaded in as a file into my Lakehouse. So I'm referring to that file, and afterwards I'm doing some uh, very minor transformations here and removing the unnecessary columns. And I'm loading this back into my lakehouse by configuring a data destination, right? Now, previously you didn't have this functionality when it comes to Power BI data flows and Power BI data flows, right? You weren't able to configure a destination for your data, right? So the destination was like a default destination where you have output tables in your data flow. But this time around, with the Gen 2, you can configure your own destination. And once again, you can't go all around the park for this. There are limitations. Like there are specific destinations that you can load your data to. Specifically, you can load your data into a lake house, Fabric Lake House, Fabric Data Warehouse, and also an Azure SQL database. So those are the main three options that you have when you are loading your data as destinations. Now, if I show you this configuration on the destination a little bit and how that looks like, um, this is pretty much what it looks like. So I'm kind of like reconfiguring the destination here by doing this. But yeah, maybe I'll actually build a data flow from scratch and show you. But yeah, simply this is the destination configured right over here, right? So that is simply that. Now you can see everything around us. The experience is very identical to Power BI data flows and also the Azure Data Factory Power Query feature. And you can see all the applied steps in your transformations right in your right hand side, and also the output table, the table name are right on top. And on the left hand side of the screen, you can see the file or the files that you are referring to get this data in. And apart from that, the transformations that you can do is right on top, very identical once again to the other the Power BI data flows and also Azure Data Factory, the Power Query feature. So it's exactly the same as you have it. The transformations are exactly the same as the transformations that you have in Power BI data flows and the Azure Data Factory Power Query. And yeah, you also can see the steps that I do in my right hand side, and also I can see the steps that I do right on top of the screen here as well. So yeah, that is pretty much what this looks like. Now, just to give you that experience of how to build a data, how we can build a data flow or a data flow gen tool, let me actually build something really quick from scratch so that you can get that exposure. Right. So firstly, how can you build a data flow Gen 2 from scratch? Just click on the new option that you see right on top and l- select data flow Gen 2. Right. So the moment that you select data flow Gen 2, a screen would pop up that is very identical to this. And the first step that you need to do is select where you need to get data from to do your transformations. So in this case, I want to get data from the data that I ingested to my lake house. So I would say get data from another source in here. And also I can simply say get data in the top bar, in the very left hand side of the top bar. So I would just say get data from another source that I see right in the middle. And I wouldn't select any of these source options, but rather I would select the lakehouse because my data is already ingested to the lakehouse. So I would select the lakehouse and I would uh, move further. So you would receive a message saying connecting to a lakehouse. And this is pretty much what my lakehouse would look like. So all these are output tables. I don't want to get data from output tables. Rather, I want to get data from for my transformation and cleansing from the files that I ingested. So the files that I ingested are in the folder, files folder. Just click on the drop down of the files folder, and you would see those two files that I took you through previously, which is sales LT customer and also sales LT product. Right now, if I click on sales LT product and just click on create, because in this case, what we'll be doing is we'll be doing some transformations to CSLT product. So this is pretty much what the end of, what it would look like after you simply select on that file that you want to do the transformations. This is what it would look like. So what would you do here is firstly, you can see my first rows of my first row is going to be the table header and it is not transformed that way. So I'll do that very basic transformation right at first. So I just made sure that my first row is a header and it's all good now. And next up, I would just select the fields that I'd like to go ahead with. So that would be, I would say I just want to go ahead with the first four fields, which is product ID, name, product number, and product color, right? So I would select those four items, right click, remove other columns. And afterwards, what I do is I would simply do some column renaming here. So in this case, I would call my column product name so that it's much more understandable, and also product color here. I did the column renaming here as well. All good. And next up, what we'll do is we'll configure a data destination, right? So the once again, go to the right bottom right hand side of your screen and you would see an option called data destination. Uh, just click on that and you would see the options that you have to simply configure as data destinations. You can configure an Azure SQL database, Lakehouse, Warehouse, and Azure Data Explorer, right? You can do that. And so in this case, I want to just load the data back after the transformations into my Lakehouse itself. So I would just click on that. So it's a default lakehouse, no changes there. Just click on next. And I would select the workspace that I want to load the data into. And also the lake house itself once again. And this is simply the lake house. And I want to load this table as product new, let's say, and simply click on next. And you can see the schema of your data with the column mapping afterwards. I'm all good with this. I'm happy about this. So I would click on save settings. And yeah, that is pretty much how you build a very basic data flow. And afterwards, you would click on publish here to make sure that your changes are saved. So I would click on publish, and yeah, so that is pretty much our data flow. Okay, I didn't give a name to my data flow, which is why it says data flow 4. Yeah, so that is pretty much how you simply build a very basic data flow. And next up, if we move to the notebook itself, right? So firstly, I'll take once again what would happen if you do the transformations with a notebook. Now, this is what a notebook would look like for you. Um, Once again, this is a notebook, and I'm doing, yeah, I'll actually take that out, this out a little bit. Doing very simple transformations from this notebook as well. Firstly, I'm just referring to that file that I ingested here, which is sltcustomer.csv. And afterwards, what I'm doing is I'm just selecting the fields that I'd like to have. And then afterwards, I'm just writing this as a table. I'm just writing this here as a table in into uh, my lake house. So this is pretty much how do you write that. So firstly, yeah, I would actually take this script out as well to avoid confusion. So firstly, I simply refer to the file, select the columns that I'd like to have, and then look at the columns, and afterwards just write it in as a table into my um, lake house, right? Now, something that you need to keep in mind here is that you don't need to write all these scripts like you did in Synapse notebooks or anything to read your files anymore, right? So let's say that I want to read a file, just open a cell or not open a cell, that doesn't really matter. So just select the file that you want to read and drag and drop it, right? And the script would be generated for yourself by itself, right? And also, let's say that you want to read a table, just select the table, drag and drop it, and then you can read the table, right? So that is pretty much how you can do that. Once again, saves a lot of time. You do need to write a lot of code. If you recall, if you are when you are doing in this Synapse notebook, so any other tools, there is a process, right? You can't directly do this. Firstly, you need to connect to your data lake storage and make sure that configuration is set up. Then link services if anything is applicable. Then afterwards, then you read the afterwards. That's when you would write the script to read your file, right? So there is a process to that. But in here, that workload is entirely cut down. One drag and drop, and you have the script, right? So that is and even when reading file from reading data from a table, it's just a single drag and drop, and you can do that, right? So this is pretty much what a fabric notebook looks like. If once again, if you had used Synapse notebooks or anything as such, you can see that the experience is very identical here, and this is pretty much what it looks like. Right. So now that was the demo. Now, apart from this, there is also some third-party tool that is coming up in the recent past that is coming up, which is apparently still in work in progress. Now, what does this third party tool do? Right now, this is once again this. Why do we need to do why do we need, what are we talking about here in terms of the third party tool? This is a third party tool to migrate your Synapse data flows to Fabric, right? A third party tool that would help you migrate your Synapse data flows to Fabric. Now, let us dig into this tool a little further, right? Um, Firstly, what does this tool do, right? So, this tool is an Azure CLI tool. It's a command line tool, right? So what that means is you need to simply do use this tool through your Azure CLI, right? And what does this tool do? This tool converts the mapping data flow script to your a Spark code, right? Now, what that would do, let's say that you have a mapping data flow already that's running in Synapse Data Flows. You can get that data flow and you can convert that into a Spark code. And then afterwards, you can use that Spark code as a Fabric notebook, not a data flow, as a Fabric notebook, right? So all the transformations that you did in the Synapse data flow, it gets converted into a Spark code, and this Spark code you would use in a Fabric notebook to run and do the transformations for you, right? So that is one strategy or one option that we have. But once again, this is a third-party tool. And a little bit more detail about this tool is that you can convert the Spark code specifically in terms of the Spark code, you can simply convert it to PySpark and also Spark Scala. And um, what I wanted to really, really stress on is this is a third party tool, right? This is not a Microsoft certified or recommended tool, but as far as I know, this is a tool that is built by Microsoft employees. I'm not sure about those details, but something that I really need to stress on is this is a third party tool and it's on Microsoft certified and recommended, right? So that is that. And something for you need to keep in mind about this tool, like moving further, is that it has its own limitations as well, specifically with the data flow properties, right? It's not like you simply get the data flow and the entire data flow would be converted to a Spark code perfectly, and then you can just run it blindly in your Fabric notebook. No, that's not how it works. There are limitations to this tool, and we'll look into this. Uh, we'll look into these details a little further in the next moment, where we'll actually look into this GitHub link for this tool, right? So I would take you through that. So let me actually open the link for this tool and we can simply go through that. All right. Now, I'm not going to take you through the entire documentation of this repo or this tool. What I want to stress on is that this is a command line tool, and what you do is simply transform your data flow script or simply the mapping data flow into a Spark code or simply a Spark Scala script. And you can get the Spark code once again, as I mentioned, in the as a PySpark notebook, or I mean, you can get this Spark code as a Microsoft Fabric's PySpark notebook or a Scala notebook, Scala Spark notebook, and simply run that in your Microsoft Fabric space, right? So that is that. And design approach, I'm not going to take you through that, but installation, that is something I will not take you through as well. But yeah, this is something really important. So source input file. So to do the so the next question would be like, how can you actually feed or how can you input the Synapse data flows into this into this particular tool, right? So there are two ways that you can input this Synapse Data Flow into this tool. Once this is firstly, this is done firstly as a file, right? You can you one option to do that is with a file, right? You can use a mapping data flow script file and simply load that script file. You can simply uh, load input a mapping data flow script file and simply convert that into a Spark code. That is one option, right? And the other option is with the configurations and with a REST API, you can actually connect to the live data flow that is running in an Azure Synapse instance and simply do the conversion and get the Spark code as well, right? So those are the two options, right? But I just want to stress on the first option a little bit because that's the most convenient. Because if you go with the source input using REST API, definitely there would be firewalls or whatnot or many other authentication and authorization that you have to go through in this process. But in that case, the most convenient would be for you to just input from a source file, right? Source input from file, right? How would you do that? Right now, something that I did not mention yet is that underneath the Synapse data flow, you do have a uh, mapping data flow script. You call it the MDF script or the Synapse data flow script, right? So you can get it by going into your Synapse data flow. And what you can do is once you have that in a file, you can simply input that file and get the Spark code or your Fabric notebook with PySpark or PyScala, right? Oh, okay, or Spark Scala, right? So that is one go-to option in terms of the inputs, right? And also, I need to stress on the limitations here. Now, just because you have the file refer, just because you have the Synapse no Synapse data flow with all the transformations, and just because you have the MDF file set up and just because you input the MDF script file, that does not mean it would cater all the transformations that are in Synapse data flows or mapping data flows, right? So uh, these are the transformation limitations that you have with the Synapse data flows. For these Synapse data flows, when you're converting this into a Spark code, right? These are the limitations that you have, right? So once again, so you can simply so what that means in here is that whatever the transformations like select color mapping, joining, unions, filters, sinks, sorts, and even referring to a respective source would be converted without a problem into a Spark code with this particular tool, right? But like there are some other transformation components, right? Like aggregations. We use a lot of aggregations when we are using Synapse data flows or simply what do you call mapping data flows, right? So you can see aggregations are not covered as a transformation component here during this conversion, right? So that is another limitation, that is like an important limitation that I saw, right? So long story short, this is the tool. This is an Azure CLI tool. You need to configure and install it in your Azure CLI, and you can use it in your Azure CLI. Two ways to simply input or simply provide the input as a Synapse data flow for this tool. One way is with the use of a file. You can simply get the MDF script code, or in other words, the mapping data flow script code from your Synapse data flow or your mapping data flow in Azure Data Factory. You can get that and you can input that and you can get the Spark it converted into a Spark code. And the other option is with the authentication, authorization, and all the other challenges that you might have, you can connect to the Synapse data flow that is lying in an instance with a REST API and simply convert that into a Spark code as well, right? Um, and limitations to this, there are limitations in the transformation components. It does not cater all the transformation components that you have in Synapse Data Flows and Mapping Data Flows, or Mapping Data Flows. So these are the only transformations that this particular tool would facilitate. Once again, this is a work in progress tool as far as I understand, and we don't know where that would get. But yeah, this is definitely an option to consider. But yeah, it has its own risk because it's not Microsoft certified, and it's work in progress in the first place, right? So that is simply that, right? Now, with that, I think I am good to conclude my session. So yeah, let me actually go to that final slide. Uh, Once again, thank you so much for joining into my session.